Don José ya van a activar el streaming, así que voy a mutear al resto de las personas, menos usted.
Ok. ¿Me pueden dar un par de minutitos? Bueno, está saliendo por YouTube, ¿no? Ok. Bueno, está bien.
A las 9 comenzamos entonces mejor.
Sí, por favor, sí.
Ya.
Muy bien. Okay. Bueno, si te pido el streaming, podemos partir. ¿Estamos listos?
Sí, continúe nomás.
Ok. Muy buenos días a todos y todas. Good morning to all, and good afternoon to those of you who are accompanying from Europe and other regions. My name is Jose Duran. I am the head of the Regional Integration Unit at United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, CEPAL, or ECLAC in English. We are very pleased to host this webinar jointly with the World Trade Organization to present the Global Value Chain Development Report 2021. The report is the product of the collaboration between 5 top institutions. It explores the long-term trends in global value chains and the factors shaping them. The report breaks new ground by providing an analysis of GVCs beyond manufactured goods, detailing how value added is increasingly generated through intangible products such as service and intellectual properties. The report also highlights that global value chains have proven resilient in the face of the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as environmental and geopolitical shocks, and shed light on the importance for the global economic recovery. The plan of today is as follows. First, Elisabetta Gentil from the Asian Development Bank and co-editor of the report will present its main finding. Then we will have a first panel on the report, moderated by Bo Meng from the Institute of Developing Economies at Japan External Trade Organization, JETRO. Finally, we will have a roundtable on resilient and sustainable global value chains in a post-pandemic world, moderated by my colleague Sebastián Herreros from ECLAT. There is a simultaneous English, Spanish, and Portuguese interpretation available. So choose your option at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for any of the panelists, please write them down in the chat, and we will try to leave some time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Okay, we have a full program today and expect to complete the webinar in a maximum of 2 hours. So, Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose, for this lovely introduction. Ladies and gentlemen from all over the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is my honor to be here today to present the key messages from the Global Value Chain Development Report 2021, Beyond Production, on behalf of the editors, the lead authors, and all the authors and all the scholars who have contributed to this work. Thank you, Jose, for already highlighting a little bit the nature of this work. I want to just begin by telling you that you can download and visualize this report from the Asian Development Bank website, but it's also on the websites of all other partners of this effort. It's important to notice that this work is the outcome of a collaboration of 5 institutions, as Jose mentioned. There is myself and my colleagues from the Asian Development Bank. Then there is also the colleagues from the Research Institute on Global Value Chains at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing, the World Trade Organization, the Institute of Development Economies, Japan External Trade Organization, and the China Development Research Foundation. The contributing organizations prepared 6 chapters over a 2-year period from 2019 to 2021. And these chapters were based on 25 background papers that were contributed from 20 research institutions in 8 different economies. We are hoping for more diverse representation in the next edition of the report. And this is the 3rd report of a biennial series, and we are now already hard at work to produce report number 4. I would like to begin this presentation by showing you the GVC participation rates for the world economy between 1995 and 2020. You will notice that we are proposing and we are using 2 different measures of GVC participation, although the message that these measures send us is the same. The first measure, the one you see in blue, is the trade-based approach, which measures GVC participation as the share of indirect trading in gross exports. The second measure, which you see in red or orange, depending on your screen, is the production-based approach, which is calculated as the share of the unfinished exports of domestic value added in total value added generated. So there are a few important things to observe in this figure already. First and foremost, that we have 2 peaks. The first one at the peak of the 2018 to 2008, before the global financial crisis, caused a sharp fall in, again, both measures of the GVC participation. The second peak and then fall is in 2018 as a consequence of the US-China trade dispute, followed closely by the COVID-19 pandemic. These two elements together caused severe disruptions to the world economy, disruptions that we are still trying to recover from today. Now, it's interesting to have a look at, on a country basis. I think here we have Brazil and Mexico representing Latin America. Hopefully, in the future, we will have more Latin American economies represented in our calculations. So let's take Mexico as an example. You can see that based on whether we are looking at trade-based or production-based measure of GVC participation, Mexico is ranked at a different position. But the message that comes out of this does not change. So the dark blue line represents GVC participation in blue. The orange or red line dot represents GVC participation in 2019. And the light blue dot represents GVC participation in 2010. And what you notice is the overwhelming majority of countries have managed to expand their GVC participation between 2000 and 2019. Interesting to notice that the People's Republic of China, which you can see in the first screen, is the fourth from the bottom, and in the second panel is the fifth from the bottom, is the one that has actually reduced its GVC participation from 35% to 34% between 2010 and 2019, undoubtedly due to the trade disputes with the United States of America. Now, a first important key message that is coming from this report is that international trade has changed, and our statistics, our measures have to catch up with these changes. What you see here is GVC participation, but this time taking into account the activities of multinational corporations. We covered the period from 2005 and 2016. So here we have broken down GVC activities into three types. The first type is trade-related GVCs, which involves trade in intermediates by domestic firms. And this is your classic measure of GVC participation. But then we also have FDI-related GVCs, which involve the sales of the local affiliates of multinational corporations in the domestic economy. And then we have the third category is trade and FDI-related GVCs, which involve all other trade in intermediates. Now, if you notice, for example, taking 2016 as a reference, we notice that the gray part of the bar, which is representing FDI-related GVC activities, is as large, almost as large or as large as the other two categories. So basically what we are saying here is that in 2016, FDI-related GVC activities accounted for 9.3% of the world GDP, and all activities combined were 20.2%. So this means that FDI-related activity, again, is half of that. And this tells us that depending on the prevalence of multinational activity in a domestic economy, if we do not incorporate activities of multinational corporations in our GVC measures, we are missing a huge chunk of GVC-related activities from our statistics. Another important element to bring into the discussion is mapping complex GVC networks. What you see here, I mean, in the report, we present several maps, but here we decided to focus on the demand perspective. Again, we are comparing 2005 on the left-hand side to 2016 on the right-hand side. And what you notice is that in this time period of more than 10 years, nothing much has changed. The United States stay firmly at the center of global demands within GVCs, which is very important fact to keep into account because we need to understand that the policies of the United States have a huge impact on the trajectory of global value chains. Now, this is another point, this is another place in our report where we highlight the importance of trade statistics evolving to take into account a new global trade landscape. So, as we mentioned in the report, as we highlight in the report, GVCs have created a new trade model where firms export the services of their intangible assets as embedded in the tangible products but these products are manufactured by foreign contract manufacturers. So this new type of trade is different from our conventional trading services, because in our conventional trading services, the intangible assets do not cross national borders. So the major players in this new trade based on intangible assets are multinational companies that specialize in developing these intangible assets, such as research and development, brands, marketing, distribution, and retailing. Apple is a typical example of such a multinational corporation. Now, we are going to show you that conventional trade statistics do not capture such extensive activities, and that can lead to some big misunderstandings in terms of the status of bilateral trade relationships. So let me show you. On the left-hand side, we have the US exports to the People's Republic of China, and on the right-hand side, we have the Chinese exports to the US. Now, we have, again, three different measures. Two of them are already widely used. The third one is proposed as new and more accurate in our report. So you can see that we have in black trade statistics in gross terms. Then we have in blue trade in value added. And then in black, we have the new measure that we are proposing, which we call trade in factor income. When we think of bilateral trade in terms of trading factor income, we define a country's export as the sum of the incomes earned by the factors belonging to the country in foreign markets. It is very important, and the visual impact of this is quite striking. It is very important to notice that once we take into account trade in intangible assets, the orange or red line with dots shows you that the US exports to the PRC increase, actually 8.2% higher than in gross value. And similarly, the PRC exports to the US decrease by 16%, so 16% lower than in gross values. Well, what is the implication of that? Well, that the trade surplus between the PRC and the US changes if we take into account the trade in intangible assets. So as you can see from the figure, again, trading factor income is the red or orange line. You will see that it's 32% lower on average than in gross value, 17.4% lower than when calculated in terms of trade in value added. This brings us to two important messages. One, that we need to expand the concept of exports by including trade in intangibles along global value chains. Second, the trade statistics, again, have to keep up. They have to be reformed to keep into account this new way of trading. And finally, as we see increasingly multinational corporations who specialize in intangible assets, then it becomes very important to strengthen IP, intellectual property protection, because that becomes vital for protecting the income of the developed economies that are already experiencing the industrialization, and basically, they generate income as knowledge economies. The next question that we talk about in the report is one of productivity, innovation, and upgrading along global value chains. So the first step that we take is to look at the workers and where they are, what kind of activities they carry out along global value chains. As you can see here, we have a sample of 15 developing Asian economies. The vertical gray line that you see is the average of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. And what we are looking at now is the actual workers, the number of jobs along global value chains. So there are two key facts that come out of this graph. The first fact is that between 2000 and 2018, the number of workers involved in global value chains in Asia has increased dramatically. But for some of these economies, already in 2000, they were above the OECD average. Take, for example, the People's Republic of China, Vietnam, the Philippines. But now in 2018, this has become even more striking with economies like Vietnam, with the number of workers involved in global value chains almost 3 times as the OECD average. So if we have all these workers, so many more than, in developing economies, in developed economies, in OECD economies, working in global value chains, then the question becomes, should we observe a massive income convergence? Should we see that the promise of job creation and development along global value chains, is fulfilled? Well, not so fast, because if we go look at productivity, that tells us the other side of the story. Again, this shows us that the overwhelming majority of these 15 developing Asian economies were able to increase their productivity between 2000 and 2018. But they started from a very low level. And so they are still well below the OECD average. And that explains why income per capita in developing Asia is 1/3 of the OECD average. Then the question becomes, so what do we do? One of the keywords, the buzzwords in global value chains has been the concept of upgrading. We have heard it a lot. So we start from a traditional perception of upgrading, a traditional description of upgrading, which is linear. It's a step-by-step incremental process whereby we go from low value-added activities such as assembly, and the firm and the economy moves up to increasingly higher value-added, higher complexity activities. So from standard module manufacturing to core module manufacturing to R&D in core modules to module-based product design and brand marketing. Think about it in terms of a mobile phone, for example. You begin with assembling mobile phones, and then little by little, you start learning how to assemble the modules, going from the standard ones to the core ones, to then starting to do your own R&D until you are all the way up. But it's precisely the new model of trade introduced by global value chains, which gives us an alternative to this long, painful, and extremely uncertain process, because we can talk about non-linear upgrading. Again, if we go back to the mobile phone example, a firm that is already assembling mobile phones can take advantage of the modularization of manufacturing, that is the standardization of these core modules that can be assembled and fit together because they abide by common standards. So a firm that is an assembly can go directly to module-based product design and brand marketing by simply sourcing core components, R&D intensive components on the global market. What does this require? Well, it requires a good knowledge of its consumer base in order to develop a product that can be perceived as different, as better than the competition. We are often conditioned to think of innovation as a frontier innovation, as developing the next generation of products. So we tend to think of innovation as R&D. but actually the process of brand creation, marketing, distribution, they can contain a lot of innovation. So in developing economies through nonlinear upgrading can become innovative. They can produce innovating products, just not innovative from the point of view of R&D and frontier technologies. The next important topic that the report covers is the fundamental role of global services value chains for service-led development. So, beyond manufacturing, services GVCs offer a new path for development, create jobs and income. And here we have two success stories that you may be familiar with to illustrate this point. The first one is the ICT, or Information and Communication Technology industry in India. We know that the success of the Indian IT industry is a result of a deep integration with the value chains of the global software industry. You can see that between 2000 and 2018, employment in the IT sector boomed, going from less than 1 million to almost 4 million people. And IT revenue as a share of GDP went from roughly, I see, over 3% to over 6%. So that's an incredible evolution. Another success story is the business process outsourcing in the Philippines. The business process outsourcing, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is the 24-hour call centers and voice services, online customer care and assistance, but also medical and legal transcription, finance and accounting, human resource activities, etc. Again, same thing between 2005 and 2019. You can see that BPO employment in the Philippines explodes from less than 250,000 to over 1 million people. And again, the BPO revenue as a share of this GDP explodes to almost 7%. What do these two economies have in common? Well, they have the human capital that allowed the economy to seize the opportunity. Both economies have English-speaking, highly educated labor force that was able to provide services that require higher specialized skills. That means, why are we saying this? We are saying this because then human capital development, education, it becomes fundamental for economies to be able to seize these opportunities. The COVID-19 pandemic has actually accelerated this process by paving the way, for example, for telemigration. And so workers who are actually providing services across borders. I have been one of those telemigrants in the past 2 years. This means that policymakers need to be proactive to prepare their economies for this development in order to reap the gains from it. It's important to notice, I think Danny Roderick of Harvard and other academics had sort of flagged the idea of premature deindustrialization, talking about how, for an economist to have a full development trajectory was important to go through a robust manufacturing development stage. But actually, we don't find any evidence of the dangers of premature deindustrialization in the data. Actually, we see that services share similar characteristics to manufacturing industries, such as scale economies and spillovers. The advantages of services by GVCs are they improve gender equality. An important example of that is the ICT industry in Vietnam, which was a boon for the employment of women. For example, we have a study that demonstrates that in a very significant way. Services GVCs are actually also substantially greener than manufacturing. Well, what are the challenges associated with that? Well, some of it we have already mentioned. They are skill intensive, so they might widen income inequality between workers who possess the skills and workers who don't. They are highly concentrated in urban environments, and so they might widen urban-rural divides. And then finally, tasks on the low skill side of services GVC are actually quite susceptible to automation. and also sensitive for this reason to labor policies of the governments where these operations are located. Next discussion is on digital platforms and global value chains. We all know that the new digital economy is built on platforms such as Google, Alibaba, Android, etc. So network effects make platforms more valuable with more users, but they are also quite unequal. The platform economy is right now very much skewed towards Asia, North America, and Europe. You can see from this pie chart that almost half of the digital platform revenue actually accrues to the Asian continent, followed by the United States, followed by the Euro area, and the rest of the world, which includes, of course, Latin America, only reaps less than 20% of the revenue. So when we talk about digital platforms, we know that they have created internet-driven value chains, and this has created the situations where there is the brick and mortar retail stores have experienced diminishing importance for decades now. And this trend has been further magnified by the COVID-19 pandemic, where there was a truthful explosion of e-commerce and people ordering and purchasing both finished products, but also parts online. What are the advantages of these digital platforms? Well, again, they make participation in GVCs easier and they reduce transaction costs. Again, they open up a door to international markets, even for smaller players. There are more benefits beyond sales, such as digital payments, financial services, etc. And again, increasing inclusivity for the small guys. But there are also challenges, because these digital platforms are highly concentrated and continue to concentrate in the hands of very few players. So regulating the monopolistic powers of digital platforms will be a significant challenge. Last but not least, or probably saving the best for last, we cannot have a discussion on global value chains without talking about the rising risks to global value chains. We begin with geopolitical shocks, which have become a primary concern in recent years. In the report, we talk about the standard measure, the United States PRC trade tensions, and we showed that they added 20% to global uncertainty since 2016. But then now we also have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has resulted in slowing economic activities, rising prices, and potentially, if an agreement cannot be found, a very serious food crisis in economies that are already battling many other problems. An example that comes from that is this contraption. Probably many of you have not seen this before. I'll tell you what this is. This is called a wire harness. This is an auto part. It's actually very low tech and very low margin. It's made of wires, plastic, and rubber, and uses a lot of low cost manual labor. This is an essential part for every car. So this is purchased from these suppliers and it is installed in the car, and all the wires in the car run through this. Well, you know, Ukraine is home to a significant chunk of the world's production of wire harness, and the war there has created a massive supply crunch. Some analysts talk about the downfall of combustion cars altogether, just due to the lack of this simple basic component. Even more, the lack of this component, the supply crunch of this component might actually trigger a leap forward in automotive technology, because car manufacturers are actually thinking of deploying a new generation of lighter machine-made harnesses that are designed for electric vehicles. So this might be put to rest just because it has become incredibly difficult to source. A second type of risk to global value chains is environmental shocks. Earthquakes, floods, typhoons. and they affect GVCs on both the demand and the supply side. Typically, these environmental shocks are highly localized in domestic networks, and they are temporarily confined. However, they are becoming more frequent, and they are hitting an increasing number of countries. So therefore, environmental risks to GVCs are expected to grow substantially. So the photo that you see in this slide is the Honda car factory in Ayutthaya province in Thailand, which in 2011 had to shut down operation because, as you can see, it was completely underwater. These particular events in Thailand put both Honda and Toyota on its knees. They had to halt their assembly lines, and that represented 7% of their combined global car production. And that was the year where the Toyota and Honda had just bounced back from the March 11 earthquake and tsunami in Japan that destroyed auto parts suppliers and upended car production around the world. And then as they were bouncing back from the Japan earthquake, they had to deal with the floods in Thailand. Final risk to global value chains is, of course, pandemic shocks. Lockdowns and border closures restrict the mobility of labor and disrupt operations, spreading the contagion effect globally. Needless to say that uncertainty undermines investment. We calculated global FDI fell 42% in 2020. Complex and lengthier GVCs with concentrated production or distribution have been the most vulnerable to pandemic shocks. And the global cost of COVID-19 lockdowns in 2021, we calculated them at a loss of 12.6% of global GDP. But I want to close on a positive note by remarking that GVCs have been surprisingly resilient in adjusting to pharmaceutical, medical equipment, and food shortages. And so it's important to notice that they were able to rise to the occasion, and especially the vaccine value chain, the vaccine supply chain was crucial to economic activity returning more or less to normal. So with that, I conclude my presentation. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion that will come after. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Elizabeth, por tan interesante presentación, bastante comprensiva. Incluso nos has abierto el apetito respecto a los impactos de la situación más actual, ¿verdad? La guerra en Ucrania, tal. Bueno, estamos con el tiempo un poquito corto. Voy a pasar al panel siguiente. Por favor, please, Bowman, you have the floor to discuss about the details of the chapter with a very you have the floor, Bo.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. And good morning and good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bowman from Japan. So it's my great honor to chair this panel discussion. So totally, I think we have almost 30 minutes. I like to divide our time into 3 parts. First of all, I'd like to use 1 or 2 minutes to introduce our distinguished panelists. And then for the open discussion across our panelists, maybe 20 minutes. And then we have 3 or 5 minutes for the Q&A. So today we have 5 panelists. All of them are either the co-editor or the lead author of our report. So we have a Professor Yu Qingxin. Good morning, Yu Qingxin. He's the Professor of National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, Japan. He's also the co-editor and also the lead author of Chapter 2 about the trading intangibles and IP production. Today we also have Elizabeth Gentil. She's here. Everyone knows her already, so I just skip. So we also have Victor Stolenzen Berg. he's the research economist from the WTO, and he's in charge of the chapter about the services value chain. Welcome, Victor. So we also have Professor Atal Solingen, who's the distinguished professor from the University of California, Irvine, and also he's a North American academic Berlin. He's in charge of the chapter about the risk to GVCs. So welcome, Tel. Last but not the least, we have Catherine Lundquist, who's the Economic Affairs Officer in WTO. She's in charge of the chapter about platform in GVCs. So welcome, Catherine. So I think this report covers a lot of topics, but all of them focus on the new evolution of GVC. So first of all, let me ask a very short question to the co-editor, Yu Qingxin, because I think the center of this chapter is about the beyond production. It's quite different from the conventional dimension when we talk about the global value chain, such as traditional trade and investment. So could you please just quickly explain why you use this new term to measure global value chains?
Okay, thank you, Bo, for the question. As you know that the theme of this report is beyond the production. Generally speaking, a global value chain consists of pre-production task, production task, and a post-production task. Actually, it is the firms which specialize in pre- and post-production task that organize global value chain and control global value chain. Those firms actually determine the distribution of value added and the location of production fragmentation. But if you look at most of studies, they simply focus on the production task. But we think those non-production tasks play more important role than production tasks. Therefore, we use the term beyond the production. In addition, if we open our vision beyond the production, we can realize that the risk to global value chain play more and more important role in shaping the location and the operation of a global value chain. So that's why, in our chapter 5, we emphasize the geopolitical tension, environmental issue, and the pandemics, the impact on the global value chain. In addition, in chapter 4, we actually focus on service value chain. When we talk about the value chain, often people think about the value chain of manufacturing industry. But we think that service industry can be a standalone global value chain. So in our chapter 4, we presented very good analysis and cases of service value chain, which play very important role for economic development of India and the Philippines. So the fundamental message of this report is, when we study global value chain, when we think about a global value chain, we should open our view and look beyond production stage and focus on non-production task.
Thank you so much, Professor Yu Qingxin. I think it's quite a very important issue because if we can find a lot of studies from international organizations such as the traditional trading goods and trading services, but I think your idea about the beyond production highly related to the trading intangibles. So could you further explain what's the difference of something like trading services and trading intangible, whether they overlap or it's very different concepts?
Okay, actually, in chapter 2, we analyze trade in intangible asset along global value chain. In the presentation, Elizabeth actually explained that is one of the reasons we propose a new concept, that the trade in income. Now, I'd like to use a simple example to explain the difference of a trade in intangible asset along the global value chain from the conventional trade in service. For example, Chinese PC maker Lenovo should pay the royalty to Microsoft company when Lenovo install the operating system in all the computers. So this kind of service fee usually is recorded as a US export to China in services. But let's think about how Apple operates. Apple also has iOS operating system, but Apple does not license the system to any maker. However, Apple gains income of its operating system by selling tangible products like iPhone, iPod, and iMac computer. Those products are not made by Apple, produced by contract manufacturers such as Foxconn. So Apple can only get the income of its iOS system by selling the products, not through licensing its intangible asset. Because this is special operation, current trade statistic cannot record this kind of trade. But actually, Apple sells the service of its intangible. It has gained billions US dollar from all its intangible asset embedded in any kind of Apple products. But if we look at our trade statistics, which are based on classic clause for one trade, therefore, trade statistic cannot capture this new type of trade in services along global value chain. As a result, the home country of this type of manufacturer, we call factorless manufacturer, have been underestimated.
Thank you so much, Yuqing. I think giving you an explanation, I think this report gives a new lens for people to look at the GVC. And this leads to a further discussion, I think, related to the Elizabeth's chapter 3, because there's a famous kind of a paradoxical concern about the GVC between the developed country, developing country, the rich country and the poor country, because they are located in very different locations. I mean, the high end or low end. Considering that issue, I think one question to Elizabeth is that your chapter 3 shows the very different types of upgrading the process the developing country may facing. So my question is, could you tell us about the ways that developing countries can upgrade in a faster, non-linear way than absent GVCs?
Thank you, Bowman, for giving me the opportunity to discuss this issue a bit more in depth, because as you can imagine, in key messages, it's a bit hard to dig deeper. So it's true. We have seen the example of the so-called Asian tigers who have created an entire industrial sector by following that painstakingly long and complex linear upgrading process, when they started again with this low value-added assembly tasks, and then little by little they have increased the complexity of their manufacturing operations. But now global value chains provide a new opportunity for developing economies, precisely because especially manufacturing, here we are really talking about manufacturing, there has been something we call modularization. That is, the finished product is broken down into modules that are compatible with each other because they are all corresponding to certain industrial recognized standards. So it's the same concept. Let me make a very simple example of when you go to a hardware store and you can ask for specific nuts and bolts that correspond to specific measurements and types. And no matter where you go, you will be able to find those elements, and they will fit together with parts that are predisposed for those nuts and bolts. This provides developing economies with the opportunity to focus on what they know best, which is their customers, their people, understand what they want, understand what the international markets are getting wrong about what these consumers want. And then using these components that are already available, widely available for purchase on international markets, these manufacturers from developing economies can put them together in a way that creates a new, different, original product that is closer to the needs of their customers. So, of course, when we were presenting this report, the objection that I heard to this was, well, you know, in your report, you're talking about China, you're talking about India, but these countries are special because they are huge. They can count on 1 billion consumers each. So, of course, you cannot repeat this model elsewhere. Well, yes and no, right? Because there is another important trend that we discussed in chapter 1 of the report, which is the trend towards regionalization of global value chains. So through regionalizations, manufacturers from developing economies can think of their region as a consumer base rather than just their small country consumer base. So that again provides an opportunity to try and go about upgrading a different way.
Thank you so much. I think large countries' case is quite difficult to copy because it's very special. So for a lot of Asian countries, I think they are facing very similar challenges like Latin America countries are facing. So the non-linear upgrading path is very important issue. Considering that issue, I think because the benefit from GVC is not automatic. The other thing is that there should be a kind of for upgrading, the knowledge transfer is very important. But as you see, given the globalization situation, my question is that about so what are the implications for knowledge transfer and innovation in developed countries given the context of the globalization?
Well, knowledge looks for the path of least resistance, right? So in this context of globalization, where there are disruptions to supply chains of products, the one thing that can move is knowledge. And that connects with the work done by Victor and his team on the importance of services, GVCs, for example, and telemigration, and all kinds of distance teams. There is one element that I wanted to highlight about this, though: the fact that there's been as a consequence of COVID-19, but this was already beginning before, with all the uncertainty coming from the US PRC trade dispute. We have seen a forced digitization, a forced innovation. So we have seen that even the most recalcitrant institutions have had no choice but to innovate to survive. So as I often mention, while the pandemic and the geopolitical situation is really creating a lot of disruption, not to mention, food crisis and other issues that I'm sure Ethel will tell us about, it is also showing an opportunity because it is eliminating a lot of political obstacles, a lot of foot dragging, and it's allowing new concepts, new idea to be operationalized faster than in normal times.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think your chapter 3 about the upgrading path in GVC is highly related to the next chapter authored by Victor, because a lot of developing countries, I think they are facing at least two challenges. One is they are still in the process of industrialization. The other thing is the challenges from a global value chain. So my question to Victor is that, what does Chapter 4 have to say to the premature industrialization debate?
Thanks, Bo. And as Elisabetta already pointed out to in her short summary, what we find is that the concerns about premature deindustrialization might increasingly not be valid anymore, because what we see is that services develop more and more these characteristics that we used to associate with manufacturing. And let me quickly maybe highlight this through two examples. One important aspect of this debate that was triggered by Roderick was that he claimed that services productivity growth is much slower, and hence wage growth and so on will be slower, and the catching up will slow down if developing countries move into services too fast. But if you look at different ways of measuring productivity in services, you see more and more, of course, on the one hand, that you have sectors within services where productivity is growing a lot, the IT sector, finance. So I think this was never disputed. But what we are also discussing in the report, and I think this is very important, in particular with respect to services value chains, is that the potential for the sectors with sluggish productivity growth, think of education, health, personal or professional services, there the potential of boosting productivity growth through services value chains, through trade, is the largest in the economy. If you just think about, what the potential would be if teachers could outsource some of them with routine tasks, or lawyers, and focus on the interpersonal relationships, which are the most important in their jobs, and where productivity can then accordingly grow, then this would be a lot of potential on the one hand for high-income countries, but importantly then, of course, also for developing countries to benefit from services value chains. And a related point where the argument is also the same, almost the same, was that in services doesn't generate enough jobs relative to manufacturing, in particular among the low skill sector. But once again, this only applies if we exclude a large amount of services from the analysis. If you once again include the healthcare sector or personal services, and you realize that these become increasingly tradable. We saw this in the COVID pandemic, that a lot of tasks that we thought cannot be done remotely can in fact be done remotely. Then these are sectors that generate a lot of jobs. So if you combine essentially this job generating potential and the productivity growth that comes from services value chains, you will see that service sectors have just as much potential to boost development than manufacturing, and therefore that this concern of premature industrialization is unwarranted. And importantly, what we also discuss is that, of course, a lot of these jobs are greener, they are more inclusive than manufacturing jobs. So there are a lot of side benefits that haven't been taken into account in the analysis. So ultimately, we consider that services value chains are indeed have great potential to boost development, be it and we saw that with India and the Philippines, but we also think there's great potential for a lot of the Latin American countries.
Thank you, Victor. I think that's very important, because if you want, I think for developing countries as a part of our world economy, if they want to get something benefit from GVC, should we first be a part of the GVC to join the GVC. But the things that I think service value chain is a little bit quite different from the let's say goods value chain, and there might be different tariff barrier or non-tariff barrier. So my question is that for them, especially for policymakers, so which policies are needed to help developing countries join the services value chain? Do you have any ideas?
So what the analysis shows that we do in the chapter is that for services, ultimately it's about human capital, it's about education. Now, the key here is that it doesn't have to be extremely high levels of education, it just needs to be targeted education. A lot of the integration to services value chains requires certain language proficiency, right? If that's one of the reasons why India was so successful in providing services to the US, because you have a lot of English speakers there. And then I guess if you would apply this to the Latin American continent, then of course to access the service value chains of the US, for instance, English is a key skill. But then again, it's not a skill that's per se hard to attain if you invest in it into schooling. And importantly, the counterpart of this is that for services, other types of capital are less important. And that's obviously what developing countries often lack. We think of the infrastructure that are necessary to transport goods from across countries, roads, ports, and so on. These are extremely expensive and usually much worse in developing countries. But importantly, for services, they are much less needed. What you need is a certain communications infrastructure, but they're often, the need is much more local. And that's it. So that offers a lot of potential. That's the one side of it. The other side, of course, as you mentioned already, is that what matters in services much more are non-tariff barriers or regulations. And I think there's a lot of potential for policymakers still to work together in terms of international cooperation, but also in terms of regional cooperation. Once again, Latin America, I think, is an example where you could do much more by harmonizing certain approaches in terms of how you regulate services trade and how you lower barriers to services trade to make the continent more productive in services.
Thank you, Victor. I think let's move on to the one of the most important issue about the risk, because we are facing the highly uncertainty. I mean, maybe in the near future, because if we look at the uncertainty index published recently, it's getting very high. Of course, the Russia-Ukraine crisis can explain 30% of that recently. So we are facing different types of risk. So my question to Professor Atel Solingen is that in your chapter, so the report indicates 3 mega risks: geopolitics and climate change, and also pandemics. So my question is that what are the commonality across these three, and how do their effects differ? Could you explain that?
Hi, thank you very much, Bo, for this introduction. I should say, though, the Ukraine situation and the current geopolitical context as it come up in some of the presentations before me, we did not deal with those, obviously, because the report was published in late 2021. But the editors were quite visionary to include, for the first time in GVC reports, a chapter on rising risks. Little did we know, and the risks would become even more pertinent to the operation of GVCs than we thought, in particular because Chapter 5 mostly addresses geopolitical risks along with environmental and pandemic risks, but geopolitical risks defined as in the sort of geoeconomic arena, trade wars, technology wars, coercive economic statecraft, and things of that nature. We did not discuss a completely different set of threats which stem from military-related geopolitical shocks. If we have time, I'll address a little bit of that as well. But returning to Bo's questions, let me just say that the 3 meta risks to GVCs that we do discuss in Chapter 5 are indeed interrelated. When we were crafting this chapter in early mid 2021, it was quite a challenge to disentangle the effects of those risks stemming from geopolitical, pandemic, and extreme weather events, because they basically became compounded. And initially, the chapter was going to address only geopolitical risks. The idea of tackling all 3 became quite pertinent, but also more difficult to disentangle. But first of all, let me say all 3 risks to GVCs are on the rise, unfortunately, as are all three risks from GVCs. What do I mean? All three risks are becoming more predictable, I believe, as we improve our understanding of the sources and mechanisms of each one of them. We try to do precisely that in chapter 5. That is, we try to clarify the sources, mechanisms, and effects of rising risks and external shocks. For instance, the rise of protectionism and extreme versions of inward-looking nationalism and populism have not only affected GVCs directly, but also fueled geopolitical tensions. Or the pandemic not only affected normal GVC operations adversely in ways in which all of you are familiar, including as we speak, but also exacerbated geopolitical tensions. Environmental threats also fuel the odds of pandemics and engender geopolitical tensions. So clearly these three meta risks create a vicious cycle. They reinforce each other. They create unfortunate synergies among them, and they compound their effects. And indeed, they generate additional risks to GVCs. For instance, in the area of cyber theft, cyber attacks, and others that become part of this vicious cycle. However, having said that, all meta risks are, of course, central to the operation of GVCs and a threat to them as we see them today. Having said that, analytically, the geopolitical tensions that threaten GVCs may be more foundational. Why? Because those tensions enhance uncertainty. Bo just provided some of the newest sort of measures of uncertainty that have risen with the Ukraine, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. The tensions then enhance uncertainty, decrease investment, increase bottlenecks that we know all too well from our current situation, especially in the food area, that I may address a little later. They unleash retaliatory tensions. They trigger contagion effects throughout GVCs. All of you are familiar with these mechanisms. And furthermore, geopolitical tensions undermine the ability of states to cooperate, to tackle climate change, future pandemics, and all the rest that must be tackled. So Russia's invasion of the Ukraine then reinforced the findings of our chapter regarding the risks of geopolitical shocks for GVCs. And even though the chapter could not address those more specific threats that come out of military invasions, the fact that rising risks was part of the report make it clear that the topic was a sine qua non for this kind of report, as those risks are unfortunately rising. I'm going to end this response to your question, Bo, by saying that the chapter was also quite explicit regarding those compounded effects of all three meta risks and what must be done immediately to contain all those risks to GVCs stemming from all three meta risks. And I can discuss some of the conclusions later if somebody's interested.
Thank you so much, Etel. I think if you have time to do more about that in the next report, maybe attract more attention from our readers for the risk to GVC. At the same time, I'd like to move on to our last panelist, Catherine, because for example, chapter 5 about the risks to GVC, we didn't use risks in GVC because I think inside GVC there's still a lot of something, for example, technological change give impacts on firms or the individuals. So one of the very quick evolution in the for the technical side is the platform. So my question to Catherine is about what kind of a digital platform makes GVC more somehow say inclusive or whole?
Thanks, Bo, for the question, and I'll try to follow up. I think in a way, that this chapter combines a lot of what has already been discussed. And regarding platforms, there are just a number of digital platforms out there. And in fact, Victor already highlighted that services trade would basically be impossible without some of these digital platforms. For instance, communication. Without platforms such as WhatsApp or other messaging services, email, Gmail, etc., you could not have the communication that's necessary across the globe in order to make these international purchases or transactions and to that really support these global value chains. And with that, though, come additional risks, and Ethel just highlighted some of them. Cybersecurity. This is a huge issue, and it grows, especially when we're talking about the inclusion of more players in global value chains, and small and medium-sized enterprises often don't have the resources available to them to have the appropriate security in place, or don't have the human capital to understand the requirements that are necessary. And this can pose a huge security issue for a global value chain that incorporates some of these smaller players. And then this plays into developing economies as well. So there's, first of all, the access to these digital platforms, and having that digital access can be very challenging. It requires a lot of infrastructure to be put in place, and we can see that in who are the regions that are the most active in global value chains, and also the most active in the digital economy. Why is that? It has to do a lot with what has already been put in place and what's available to users. I tend to think that if somebody has access to these tools, they are likely to use them. Sometimes it doesn't even require training. It only requires having the ability to use them and have a reliable internet connection and access. Because in fact, small players have shown that they are willing to join the platform economy if they can just reach that platform and have a reliable internet access or a reliable telephone connection that can get them to the next step. And those were modularization. I think that was the one other point that I really wanted to highlight here, in terms of that is the way that small businesses in particular can take advantage of the new digital economy and digital platforms. It's these smaller pieces of production that a smaller business can look to and specialize in a certain item of production, and to really put that out there and join a global value chain in that way by focusing on these smaller portions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think this issue highly relates to another kind of a very sensitive issue. See, countries or firms, especially in developing countries, if they could access the platform, that's a good opportunity for them to be involved in. But at the same time, different countries may say that platform, especially about their data access, security, or privacy, with different policy. So, is there any and the common sense from the WTO to consider a kind of upgrading of this kind of agreement about the big data, such as the privacy or the security related issue, because they highly relate to the also geopolitical issues?
So this is an excellent question, and definitely sort of goes beyond what I think I'm capable of discussing here, but it is something that policymakers are aware of, and I know that it's in discussion within the e-commerce group at the World Trade Organization. But data access, data privacy, data security, all of these are points that are going to be critical in order to bring more players from around the world into global value chains and into more participation, especially in this digital platform economy. As I noted, it's these cybersecurity, it's the weakest link that can often be the one who is not has not studied how to protect their data, how to protect their online resources, that can then take down an entire international company. So these entry points are going to be critical in order to secure them and to bring in these other players into the economy, the global economy.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So I think from my side, I already arranged the discussion, but I also saw some Q&A from our chat box, but I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish, so it's quite difficult for me to pass these questions to our panelists. One is, I think, is about yes. Jose, could you, if possible, could you please let me see. Yeah, can knowledge be transferred? This is one question. Let's see. In the case of standardized module, the possible yes. But since the knowledge for the design and of the products would be transferred, yes. If this were to happen, it's possible. That I will cite some examples. So I think this might relate to Yuqing's chapter. Yuqing, could you possibly, or Elizabeth also give a response?
I think it's possible to have a knowledge transfer if firms from developing country participate in global value chain led by multinational company of developing economy. Sometimes the people are confused about the possibility of knowledge transfer simply because their expectation is too high. You know, when Apple designate a Chinese company like Gufen as a contract manufacturer of airport, Apple sent its engineer to work with the engineer of a Gufen company in order to make sure Gufen company can produce the airport up to the standard of Apple. Usually, like the engineer of the lead company of value chain, they tend to teach the production know-how, and they even specify the material needed for making products and the equipment which are necessary for assembling or production. So this kind of interaction between lead firm and other firm which specialize in the task allocated by lead firm actually are quite intensive. So that's why when we talk about the global value chain, there is one thing we should keep in mind: the relationship between lead firm and non-lead firms are defined by a contract. It's not like a market base. That is, a company sell products, then you come another company buy the products. There is no any kind of contract binding relation. No, actually there is a clearly, a cooperation and a well-defined relationship between the firms. So the contract actually specifies the obligation of the firm which have relatively advanced technology and the production know-how. Another thing is this, we talk about this so-called, reversal engineering, right? So traditionally, when less developed firm try to use reverse engineering to copy the more advanced products, it's quite complicated. But now, global value chain tell you clearly how a product is made, what kind of components are necessary. Therefore, we don't need this sophisticated, reverse engineering process.
Thank you so much. And Elizabeth, would you like to add more words?
No, Yuqing has already done, his best.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it's time is approaching. Let me close this panelist discussion. So let me pass the thanks to all the panelists for your efforts. Thank you so much. And then let me pass the mic to Jose.
Thank you both for this very interesting table. Now let's move to the next one, the roundtable about resilient and sustainable global value chains in the post-pandemic world, sign a Latin American perspective. Sebastián Herreros will moderate. Sebastián, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or evening to all of you, depending on where you are. We have a very distinguished set of panelists for this second roundtable and very little time. So I will, with your indulgence, I will switch to Spanish here, since 4 out of our 5 panelists are Spanish speaking or Latin Americans. And I don't have no tengo una pregunta para cada uno de nuestros panelistas, más bien quisiera hacer un par de reflexiones personales sobre lo que hemos escuchado hasta ahora y después pedirle a cada uno de nuestros panelistas que nos entregue sus impresiones sobre, a la luz de estas reflexiones que voy a hacer y que tienen que ver, como es obvio, sobre la posición de América Latina en las cadenas globales de valor. Creo que ha quedado claro en la sesión previa, en la mesa redonda que acabamos de terminar, que ya no estamos en los años dorados de la globalización de los años 90 y de los años 2000 hasta antes de la crisis financiera mundial. Estamos en un mundo distinto, nos guste o no, eso es beside the point, como se diría en inglés. Estamos en un mundo distinto, en un mundo en que el comercio está mucho más mediatizado por la geopolítica, en que se ha debilitado el marco de la cooperación multilateral, de la gobernanza multilateral del comercio, en que los países están privilegiando lo que se llama la autonomía estratégica por sobre la eficiencia económica o la minimización de costos, y en que se está hablando de una creciente tendencia a la regionalización, a circuitos más cortos de producción y de comercio. No necesariamente lo estamos viendo aún en la evidencia empírica, pero todo parece indicar que vamos en esa dirección, y así ocurre en Europa, se ocurre en Asia, se ocurre en América del Norte. Pues bien, entonces la reflexión es, ok, América Latina tradicionalmente no ha figurado mucho en las cadenas de valor, por lo menos las cadenas de valor clásicas manufactureras, con escasas excepciones dictadas fundamentalmente por la geografía, como pueden ser México, Costa Rica, República Dominicana. La pregunta es, en este nuevo escenario de la globalización, en que vamos hacia una globalización más regionalizada, en que se habla de posibilidades de nearshoring, en fin, la pregunta es ¿cómo ven ustedes, esta es la pregunta para cada uno de nuestros panelistas, las posibilidades de los países latinoamericanos de lograr una mayor inserción en las cadenas globales de valor y ciertamente una mayor autonomía productiva? Y digo esto porque, bueno, cuando llegó la pandemia, de repente nos vimos confrontados con que no teníamos equipos de protección personal, con que no teníamos ventiladores mecánicos, con que no teníamos muchos de los productos farmacéuticos requeridos para enfrentar la pandemia, y la gente moría y no había cómo conseguirlo, porque siempre se dijo, bueno, esto lo podemos comprar, ¿para qué lo vamos a producir? Lo podemos comprar, sí. Sí, claro, eso está muy bien cuando las cosas son business as usual, pero ya no estamos en el mundo business as usual, y entonces el tema de cómo, o el asunto de los fertilizantes ahora. Esta es una región agroexportadora, depende críticamente de los fertilizantes, y los fertilizantes no se fabrican en América Latina, sino en Rusia y otros lugares, y ya no es obvio si podemos acceder a ellos o no. Entonces la pregunta es cómo en este nuevo mundo mucho más complejo e incierto, cómo ven las posibilidades de generar una mayor integración productiva entre los países latinoamericanos para generar una mayor autonomía estratégica y eso. Bueno, muchísimas gracias, perdón por haberme extendido más allá de lo que quería. Dr. Yukin Xing, you go first.
Okay, I agree with you that today is different with the last 4 decades, when the global value chain had been developed extensively. Number one, the whole world has been hit by the pandemic. Now the pandemic still continue. As you mentioned, at the beginning of the pandemic outbreak, many countries, including Latin American countries, was struggling to have sufficient personal protective equipment, lacking of masks, ventilators, and maybe even some medicine. This is sudden, increase for those medical supply is due to the pandemic. I think most of the country was not prepared. This is number one. Number two, because many countries depend on global value chain to supply medical equipment, in particular, the one related with prevent us from the infection. Like China produced about 50% of global mask exports. However, China was the country hit first by the pandemic. Then what happened is made in China mask was supposed to supply to the global demand, but the Chinese government prioritized domestic demand. So that's why some people said made in China suddenly turned into used by China. So this actually raises a question, that is how much a country should depend on the supply of a foreign country in many important goods. In particular, we think about the goods related with citizens' health, or some kind of products which is strategically important for a country. So for Latin American, I think maybe it is time for Latin American country to think how you develop a localized supply chain which can provide those essential medical goods for the people in Latin American country, or as important a supply to your biggest neighbor of the US. Not just, a Latin American country feels this kind of difficulty. European country and the US, they all had the difficulty at the beginning. Even Japan, that's the country I'm living now. So that's why the Japanese government has decided to subsidize Japanese company if they reallocate their supply chain in manufacturing essential medical goods, which include pharmaceutical products and very important medical equipment, back to Japan, or diversify their value chain from China to South Asia or Southeast Asia. Now, we talk about the so-called restructuring of a supply chain. I think restructuring of a supply chain in pharmaceutical industry or in the industry related with medical goods or strategically important industries such as the semiconductor industry will be inevitable. Let me mention another opportunity of Latin American country may have because of China-US trade war and the political tension between those two countries. Now there is talk about a so-called friendly value chain or trustworthy value chain. So this may also provide an opportunity for Latin American country to join the regional value chain led by American company or European company.
Thank you, Dr. Xing. I forgot to mention Dr. Xing is the Director of Asian Economic Policy at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. I think you have come up with some very sensible suggestions on the way forward in terms of reorganizing production in the region. I mean, yes, this notion of this possible arrival of US investments, to Latin America back from China and Asia. There's a lot of talk about that. It remains to be seen how much of that will actually take place and if it takes place, how many countries will benefit other than the usual places that receive those sorts of investments like Mexico and a few countries in Central America. But that remains to be seen. Now I will give the floor to my colleague Jose Duran, who apparently is not at present. So I will skip Jose now and we'll move with Dr. Ariel Birkerman, who's a lecturer in economics at Goldsmiths College, University of London. Ariel, tu turno, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sebastian. I hope you can hear me. I would like to just very quickly touch upon first, the rising risks to global value chains are occurring in a context of First, increasing global income share of emerging economies. Between 1995 and 2018, for example, the People's Republic of China increased its share in global income by almost 14 percentage points. So did India by 2 percentage points, but also regions that are catching up with Western Europe, such as Eastern Europe, ASEAN, and the rest of the world. At the same time, we are in a situation where there is increasing South-South global value chain integration. For example, in 1995, 70% of income activated by foreign demand in a medium country from the global South came from the global North, 70%. In 2018, the global North and the global South activate income in a median country from the global South in almost equal percentage. So there is an increasing importance of the global South as an activating source of income in the global South. The second point is that we seem to be seeing three alternative GVC integration models for Factory Europe, Factory America, and Factory Asia. Europe is increasingly nearshoring its input sourcing, while it depends on extra European final demand to activate its value added. So it's an export-led model. Asia Pacific is also increasingly geographically narrowing input sourcing, but the trend is for domestic final demand to become a key output destination. So it's the Asian domestic economies that are triggering income activation within Asia Pacific. And North and Latin America and the Caribbean had the lowest level of regional GVC integration, which particularly diminished since China entered the WTO. The third and final point of this context concerns the unequal functional income distribution activated by final exports. In 2018, when countries from Latin America export $100 of final products to other Latin American countries, 41 of those dollars go to compensation of employees. When the final output destination is North America or China, only $27 or $32 respectively go to employee compensation. So the commodity composition of the final export basket matters enormously for functional income distribution. Hence, if bilateral specialization on products whose total direct and indirect production requirements come from industries with low wage shares, intensification of trade with certain destinations have sharp distributional implications in the home economy. In this context, I was asked to reflect on the reality of GVC integration in Latin America in specifically 4 value chains: agricultural products, food products, pharmaceuticals, and computing and specialized equipment. And what's the comparison with the reality in Latin America with Asia Pacific for those same GVCs? And in agri-food, backward GVC integration is relatively low in Latin America. This is understandable for agricultural products, but there is a non-negligible dependence from Latin America on input sourcing from North America and the European single market. Whereas in pharmaceuticals and computing and specialized equipment, which are chains of higher technological complexity, instead, Europe and China, respectively, have overtaken North America as the most important foreign input provider in value-added terms for the median Latin American country. And across chains, the most relevant integration of Latin America with Asia is through China, and there is no doubt about that. Input sourcing in Asia Pacific instead shows a more balanced picture, with regions contributing to each other country's foreign value-added share less unevenly. So China and ASEAN became more important input providers in the area of agri-food chains. China seems to have replaced the prominent role of the European single market in pharmaceuticals and developed Asia Pacific in computing and specialized equipment. So overall, GVCs articulated by countries in Asia Pacific have relatively high intra-regional backward integration, something that Latin America is lacking. Based on these considerations, what are the opportunities for intra-regional GVC integration in Latin America? In most cases, opportunities with associated challenges are in terms of backward integration. In agri-food, I believe Latin America should reduce sourcing dependence of specialized inputs from Europe and North America. In pharmaceuticals, in order to develop local absorptive capacities through R&D imitation efforts and physical and digital infrastructure. This will become crucial given the crucial role of intellectual property linked to input sourcing from North America, the European single market, and increasingly China in pharmaceutical products within chains articulated in Latin America. And finally, in computing and specialized equipment to avoid the trajectory of very high input sourcing dependence from China, as it may prove challenging to finance exponential growth of Latin American demand for high-tech products, it will be crucial to reduce the sourcing dependence from China in view of a path of increasing regional digitalization in the region. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ariel. Quisiera destacar dos puntos centrales de lo que acabas de exponer. Por un lado, y lo agradezco mucho, exponer las implicancias distributivas que tienen los distintos patrones de inserción en el comercio internacional. Efectivamente, esto refuerza lo que nosotros venimos diciendo en la CEPAL, la exportación de materias primas a Asia, Europa, en menor medida América del Norte, contribuye mucho menos a la equidad social, a la equidad de ingresos, que el comercio que tiene lugar dentro de la propia región latinoamericana, que es mucho más intensivo en manufacturas y en la cual, por lo tanto, el componente salarios es mucho más importante. Y esa ya por sí misma es una muy buena razón por la cual tratar de promover una mayor integración productiva intrarregional y mayores niveles de comercio intrarregional, que en América Latina son de los más bajos del mundo, alrededor de 13-14%. Ese es un primer punto que destaco mucho, y el segundo es lo que tú mencionabas sobre la necesidad o la conveniencia de avanzar hacia reducir los backward linkages que tiene la región en algunas industrias. Por ejemplo, en agroindustria, la fuerte dependencia, lo acababa de mencionar hace un momento, de fertilizantes que básicamente no se producen en América Latina, o en el caso de la industria farmacéutica, la casi total dependencia de los principios activos necesarios para elaborar medicamentos. América Latina en algún momento fabricaba principios activos, ya no lo hace. Ahora todos vienen de China, de la India, de países europeos. Entonces, efectivamente, si queremos empezar a construir esas cadenas, hay que partir desde el comienzo, digamos, y ver cómo generar una mayor capacidad de producir internamente algunos de esos insumos clave que hoy en día la región prácticamente no produce en absoluto. Bueno, ahora sí le doy la palabra a mi colega José Durán. José, adelante.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Sebastián. Bueno, está claro que el mundo de hoy está más resistente a la globalización que la que teníamos hace una década, ¿no? Eso se evidencia en las tensiones geopolíticas que el informe documenta muy bien. La región ha sufrido gravemente esas crisis. Ya lo decía el profesor Chuquín, con la pandemia, la incertidumbre por la falta de mascarillas, por ejemplo, respiradores, medicinas, para controlar la infección, nos hizo vivir una verdadera pesadilla. La región sufrió mucho. Y la salud estaba en el centro de las preocupaciones de todos los gobiernos. Otro episodio de tensión se produjo como resultado de la escasez de semiconductores. Por momentos paralizó la producción de vehículos y luego de otras manufacturas. Otro problema fue la ruptura de las cadenas de suministro y el aumento del coste de transporte, y esto arroja mucha más incertidumbre. Y por cierto, el hecho de que muchos países de América Latina, ya Sebastián lo mencionó, dependan crucialmente de fertilizantes de origen ruso, inyecta más complejidad todavía a este problema. En América Latina podemos decir entonces que nos hemos dado cuenta que la globalización de alguna manera ha dejado a nuestros países más vulnerables. Sobre todo los más pequeños y más conectados con las grandes, y menos conectados con las grandes fábricas. Muy bien lo decía Elizabeth, México, Brasil están más conectados que el resto de la región, y la salud, la producción de insumos y equipo médico, las vacunas, los fertilizantes, en el caso de los vehículos, los repuestos, ¿verdad? Y las maquinarias y equipos, necesitan un comercio fluido y que no esté sujeto a las tensiones de la globalización. Y entonces, todo ello en la CEPAL nos ha llevado a reflexionar sobre la necesidad de avanzar hasta a explorar el potencial existente en la integración regional. En un conjunto de sectores estratégicos que, como mencioné antes, durante la crisis se revelaron muy vulnerables. Estos sectores, para nosotros, estos sectores resilientes, que la región necesita impulsar son, primero, farmacia y equipo médico, electromovilidad, la producción de fertilizantes, aunque ahí va a ser más difícil, entre otros, incluyendo el uso de medios y plataformas digitales en su desarrollo. También es un tema importante, el tema de la economía digital. Entonces, primero, promover la provisión de productos farmacéuticos. En este punto, ya la CEPAL ha impulsado un programa de autosuficiencia sanitaria tendiente a que la región pueda abastecerse en mayor medida mediante la producción regional de medicamentos clave para garantizar la salud humana. Tiene que haber un esfuerzo deliberado de política para que esto pues, sea una realidad, como mencionaba el profesor Yukin Kim. Y luego, segundo, el impulso a la movilidad urbana mediante el aprovechamiento de la capacidad productiva existente en la producción de vehículos eléctricos. Nosotros sabemos que China ahora domina la producción de equipos eléctricos, más del 90% de la producción. Hay ciudades en China que tienen muchos, por ejemplo, Shenzhen, el 100% de su sistema de movilidad es eléctrico. Pues la región que está también transitando hacia reducir las emisiones y aumentar el número de vehículos eléctricos, es una oportunidad, dado que hay producción en Brasil, en México, de buses convencionales, de moverse hacia electromovilidad con cadenas de valor regionales y que permitan que la región use la capacidad instalada para producir también insumos intermedios a nivel subregional, y ahí Brasil y México tienen mucho que decir. Y luego también esfuerzos para mejorar o impulsar la complementariedad productiva en la fabricación de fertilizantes, como decía, a nivel regional es importante, aunque ahí va a ser un poco más difícil, pero hay un desafío, ¿verdad? La región necesita una integración regional que sea más funcional al impulso de cadenas de valor regionales. Esa sería la gran conclusión, es decir, más regionalismo y conexiones productivas en sectores estratégicos, ¿no? Y ahí es decir que, como mencionaba Ariel, ¿verdad? Por ejemplo, en el tema agrícola o agroindustrial, la región es muy complementaria. América del Sur con Centroamérica, Centroamérica con México, y en este sentido hay que aprovechar esas complementariedades. Entonces en CEPAL estamos comprometidos con impulsar esas complementariedades entre países. A eso apunta nuestro trabajo, ya Sebastián lo mencionó, evidencia empírica que pudiera sustentar estos mayores vínculos es lo que estamos tratando de desarrollar a partir de nuestro trabajo con insumo producto e ir mapeando esos sectores productivos, ¿no? También mencionaba Sebastián, la región tiene su comercio interregional es un 14%, eso es incluso más bajo que África, que es donde es un 15%. Es un desafío muy grande. La región está más conectada con Estados Unidos, con China, con Asia, hacia adelante, exporta soja, hierro, mineral de cobre, y tiene ese desafío importante. Entonces la región requiere repensar de manera estratégica el espacio ampliado que compone sus 33 países, en función de los sectores que la producción regional necesita para no depender de las grandes cadenas de valor, sino de las complementariedades entre los países. Aquí lo quiero remarcar, y en la CEPAL estamos comprometidos con este trabajo. Nos acompañan como oyentes, funcionarios que trabajan con cuentas nacionales, expertos en la estructura productiva de varios países de la región, y nos están ayudando a completar digamos, el mapa de integración productiva entre todos los países de la región, tal como lo han hecho los colegas del Banco Asiático de Desarrollo, conectando los puntos de la estructura productiva entre todos los países de Asia. Nosotros lo queremos hacer también en América Latina, lo hemos hecho para años anteriores y queremos profundizar, y entonces con eso decir que queremos tener evidencia empírica para poder aprovechar esas complementariedades, identificar dónde están esos brotes verdes de cadenas de valor para poder mejorar e incrementar la integración regional. Bueno, para concluir, quiero decir que nuestros esfuerzos no apuntan a promover autarquía económica, sino las capacidades productivas de la región mediante la integración, tal como lo han hecho Europa, Asia Oriental y América del Norte. Eso es lo que tendría que... esas serían mis conclusiones, Sebastián. Te devuelvo la palabra.
Muchas gracias, José. Y bueno, oye, todos, felicitaciones a todos porque han sido extremadamente disciplinados con el uso del tiempo, sin siquiera yo tener que decírselo. Bueno, y justamente en aras del tiempo le voy a dar la palabra ahora a Renato Baumann. Renato es coordinador de cooperación internacional en el Instituto de Pesquisa Económica Aplicada de de Brasil y además un gran amigo de la CEPAL y por largos años trabajó aquí, es un cepalino de corazón. I don't know how you are going to translate that into English, but he's a cepalino. But okay, Renato, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. We have learned quite a lot of indications with regard to in the presentation of the report. I would make a presentation, my presentation would be related to an overall scenario with regard to GVCs and then a little bit about Latin America as such. Going back, rewind a little bit, before the pandemic, what did we have? We had a number of bias towards protectionism, the US and China economic tension, and then a number of political outcomes in Europe and the election of Trump and so on and so forth. And then the word deglobalization came in. Now, the point is, at the same time, the concern with a very rapid innovation process, which is the basic characteristics that we have in this digital economy of these days. The pace of technical progress makes it or imposes the deglobalization a bound limit. Because having access to imported inputs, more efficient and even cheaper inputs, is a base condition for competitiveness. And this is one of the reasons why countries involved in global value chains are so competitive in their exports. The alternative of import substitution is increasingly less reasonable by one simple reason. It takes time for you to implement a productive unit and replace imports, whereas technical progress is much faster than that. And hence there is a technical limit to the globalization. If it's so, then we have a situation where productive processes are bound to be more complementary and economies are bound to be more open than in the past. Now, having said that, the pandemic brought a number of issues. Of course, access to inputs, of course, transportation bottlenecks, the constraints linked to lockdowns and so on and so forth. But there are also two important dimensions that I haven't seen mentioned so far. One is that to face the lockdowns, we did have the quantitative easing, unprecedented amount of monetary expansion coming from the main economies and also from a number of developing economies. Brazil is one example. Now we're having the reverse process. Now we are having the quantitative tightening. And this is not a minor issue. Why so? Because two outcomes of this process. We are bound to live, at least in coming years, with lower growth, global-wise, and high inflation. Now, on top of that comes, of course, Russia-Ukraine conflict, and adding to a blurring scenario, a number of issues that have been mentioned: fertilizers, corn, wheat, a number of industrial components, and so on and so forth, apart from instability and uncertainty for potential investors. Now, in this overall scenario, how can we forecast what comes next? I will try and contribute with four possible scenarios, not adding any probability to any of them, but two possible scenarios. Scenario one, I call it doomsday scenario: deepening and spreading of the military conflict in Europe and the likely involvement of the US, China, and others with unpredictable consequences. Nothing can be said about the production structure. We would have an open war. God, don't avoid that. Second scenario is the pandemic scenario, a revival of pandemic, leading to renewed lockdowns. The negative impact on GVC is predictable, and we are bound to see even more intense dismantling of existing GVCs with emphasis in import substitution. Scenario 3, East-West split. End of the conflict in Eastern Europe, but a deepening of economic, not military, tension between the US, the European Union and their allies, versus China and its allies. In this scenario, GVCs will still be a common feature, but with significant reshoring. This will probably mean opportunities for developing countries to provide the supply of specific items, but with the likely cost of having to align with one or the other side, as well as the need to opt for productive standards. We have different productive standards in the US, European Union, and China, and increasingly different so. The fourth scenario, I call it more of the same. Peace in Eastern Europe, plus less economic East-West tension. The concern with diversifying supplies will still lead to reshoring of some magnitude. GVCs remain as one noticeable feature as they are today, with the geographic relocation of some activities. Now, I don't know what the probability are for these four scenarios, but God help us that scenarios 3 and 4 are more likely, the ones without conflict and without pandemic. This will mean that GVCs are here to stay, and countries like the Latin American ones should keep in mind the need to devise policies to facilitate their participation as a means to improve their export performance, as well as to absorb better inputs and best practices. Now, in the Latin America scenario that we see right now, we do participate in global GVCs, but as I used to say, from the back door. We basically provide raw materials. In the SMILE curve, we are in the lower part of the SMILE curve. We can think of two types of value chains: global value chains, and then we participate very badly, or regional value chains. And this is close to nothing, as other people have already told. Even worse, when we see the indicators of the regional purchase of inputs, domestically or regionally produced inputs as a share of regional exports, that indicator has actually come down. It's not only a poor level of regional integration, productive complementarity, sorry, but the degree of productive complementarity has been reduced over time. Now, how to deal with that? Of course, we have done with ECLAC input-output matrix. I know that Duran has been chairing a number of exercises in this regard. This is the technical side of it. I have listed a number of suggestions in terms of improving and increasing industrial complementarity in the region. But I wonder how to do that when we see the strong process of deindustrialization in our economies. And why so? Because we have been so wealthy in terms of exporting commodities that it is very difficult for you to convince the economic team to renew the incentives to the industrial sector. Why so? Because the inflow of foreign currency is okay, because commodity prices are booming, and you don't need to worry about that based on balance of payment constraints. It's not binding right now, and it has not been binding for quite some years now. And hence the exchange rate, the real exchange rate goes down, and hence the industrial sector suffers from that, and its competitiveness, international competitiveness goes down. On top of that, what is the political scenario in the region right now? We have a number of center of left, if not leftist, presidents in the region. It's not quite clear how far this has or is able to translate into renewed efforts to build joint speech or joint efforts to provide productive complementarity. We in Latin America have over 70 years of speech in terms of regional integration. It's probably the region, the richest in terms of speeches, in terms of regional integration. And yet, the outcome is so poor. The lack of political will, I think it's perhaps the main constraint right now. We don't see, speaking clearly, an interaction between the Brazilian president and the Argentine president and the Chilean president, and now in Colombia, whatever Petro is going to do. It's hard to identify a favorable scenario in the way that we would desire, and in the way that has been mentioned here in terms of intensifying complementarity in manufacturing sectors or so. What we see is more efforts towards intensifying the participation in value chains elsewhere. Argentina has recently signed an agreement with China in that regard. Brazil is a little
Renato,
bit.
could you wrap up, perhaps, a couple of minutes?
Final comment. I don't want to give a wholly pessimist message, but I hope to have brought some quote-unquote realistic issues to this debate. And here I stop. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Renato, y concuerdo contigo, y efectivamente la tarea de aumentar la integración productiva en nuestras regiones es una tarea difícil porque la dinámica de la exportación de materias primas tiende a autoperpetuarse, digamos. La economía política, como tú bien dijiste, actúa en esa dirección hacia cada vez más profundizar el modelo de exportación de materias primas, hacia cada vez de industrializar más, y a medida que hay más desindustrialización es menor el grado de complementariedad productiva existente. Por lo tanto, es toda una dinámica perniciosa, muy difícil de revertir. Queremos pensar que no es imposible de revertir, pero ciertamente es difícil por una serie de razones. Y bueno, justamente eso creo que nos lleva muy bien a la intervención, de nuestro último panelista, Felipe Bertamini. Felipe es funcionario de la Asociación Latinoamericana de Integración, ALADI. For those of you outside Latin America who may not be familiar, ALADI is the broadest forum for regional economic integration in Latin America. Y bueno, por lo tanto, Felipe, quizás si nos pudieras dar algunas palabras sobre, bueno, cómo miran ustedes desde la LADI la posibilidad de generar mayores encadenamientos productivos, mayor integración productiva entre los países latinoamericanos. Sería estupendo. Felipe, tienes la palabra, unos 6 minutos, ojalá no más, porque ya, bueno, se nos está acabando el tiempo.
Hola Sebastián, bueno, muchas gracias por tus palabras. Creo que desde la LADI estamos convencidos y somos conscientes que estamos en un momento justo y oportuno para el desarrollo del comercio interregional de América Latina. Oportuno en el sentido de que hay algunas luces verdes en cuanto al crecimiento de las economías de los países miembros de la LADI. Algunas estimaciones cuentan que para el 2022 se espera un crecimiento del 2.1%. Con respecto al comercio a nivel de las zonas y de los países miembros, en el 2021 creció un 40%. Por eso entendemos que en este sentido la LADI tiene mucho para ofrecer como organismo subregional. Es el organismo más antiguo de la región, con 13 países miembros, como les comenté. Tiene un mercado de más de 500 millones de consumidores y un Producto Interno Bruto de aproximadamente 4.5 billones de dólares. Además, como espacio, cuenta con una amplia red de acuerdos comerciales de diferente alcance, cobertura, profundidad, que abarca el 85% del mercado regional liberado de aranceles. Tenemos más que cerca de 105 acuerdos regionales suscritos bajo la órbita de la LADI, 83 acuerdos al interior de la LADI, más 22 acuerdos de los países miembros con no miembros de la LADI. Trabajamos en temas no solo arancelarios, sino también como facilitación de comercio, con respecto a acuerdos comerciales preferenciales, estabilización de regulaciones con base de normas y prácticas internacionales, convergencia regulatoria, firma digital, comercio electrónico, convenio de pagos, certificación de origen digital, entre otros aspectos. También abordamos temas de infraestructura y logística, los acuerdos de transporte tanto terrestre y fluvial. Aportamos a los estudios, por ejemplo, el año pasado hicimos una presentación sobre la hidrovía del Paraguay y Paraná, que mostraba básicamente los beneficios de salir la producción de los países del centro de América del Sur por el océano Atlántico. También trabajamos en temas de convergencia, acuerdos preferenciales y medidas no arancelarias. Tenemos una dinámica agenda digital, mercado regional digital, comercio electrónico, servicios de firma digital, entre otros. Y como otra herramienta importante, también trabajamos en el ámbito de la promoción del comercio y la tecnología. O sea, son todos espacios que los empresarios, especialmente las MIPYMES de la región, conozcan y aprovechen los beneficios de los acuerdos suscritos en el Tratado de Montevideo del año 1980. También en los últimos años hemos desarrollado una plataforma de pymes latinas grandes negocios. Ahí, si ustedes acceden a esa plataforma, pueden encontrar 4 módulos bien diferenciados. Una parte que tiene que ver con el centro de negocios, una parte que tiene que ver con el centro de información, donde los empresarios pueden acceder a todo tipo de información en cuanto a acceso a mercado, preferencias, medidas no arancelarias, entre otras cuestiones. También disponemos de un centro de capacitación, donde permanentemente estamos brindando capacitación a funcionarios tanto públicos, empresas, entre otros de la región. Y finalmente el último módulo es un centro de logístico, donde ahí el empresario puede acceder a informes sobre trámites y costos para poder comercializar sus productos dentro de la región. Además, en este último año hemos hecho estamos planificando 3 eventos de promoción comercial para poder fomentar y conectar a las diferentes empresas de la región. Básicamente, la idea de mi presentación era presentar eso un poco y poner al servicio de los países miembros de la LADI y al resto del mundo, obviamente, los instrumentos que estamos trabajando desde la LADI.
Muchas gracias, Felipe, y efectivamente nosotros desde la CEPAL conocemos bien el trabajo de la LADI y los múltiples tracks, digamos, en los cuales la organización trabaja para promover la integración comercial y productiva entre los países de la región, y bueno, al final la intensidad con que eso avance depende fundamentalmente, y ya lo decía Renato, también de la voluntad política de los gobiernos. El foro, que es ALADI, existe, la institución existe, ahora lo que se requiere, por cierto, es una mayor voluntad política de los países de la región para acelerar esos trabajos. Bueno, yo sin más daría término a esta mesa redonda. Sé que Ethel pidió la palabra, así que you have the floor.
Solamente si hay unos minutos, si hay que terminar, no importa.
José, tú dirás, me parece que podemos tener...
Con la venida de nuestros colegas intérpretes, si unos 5 minutos, ¿sí? ¿Puede ser? Please.
Muchas gracias. Thank you. I just really will take less than a minute to say that I agree with a lot of what I heard. But I think we need to come to terms with the fact that the dramatic expansion of GVC activities including GVC density and acquisition of skills and capabilities in East Asia did not stem from guided regionalism, but actually from integration in global GVCs, en cadenas globales, no cadenas regionales. Las dos no son mutually exclusive, of course, but there is a synergy among the two, and we should not throw any baby with the bathwater. The other thing that I wanted to say very quickly, maybe another 30 seconds, is that Sebastian stated that we'll have to see how much of North American GVCs can actually near shore to the rest of the continent. That's correct. Some of that is happening. We don't know we don't have metrics yet to measure that. But of course, it's a function of local absorption capabilities and all the rest that you're very familiar with, but also most importantly, and Renato raised this issue, most importantly, it has to do with political receptivity by the governments of the region. And on that one, I think I want to mention an article yesterday by Martin Wolf. Most of you, I'm sure, read his readings, warning that we may be overestimating so-called deglobalization. That yes, there is a transformation of the global structure or the global geography of GVCs and so on, but the death of globalization may be prematurely announced, and actually those announcements have real life implications. And so we should, I think, be very careful about how we portray our findings to the broader community. Thank you.
Fair enough. No, nobody's saying globalization is over. But the common sense seems to be that we are in a new sort of globalization,
yes,
which has a stronger regional component. That's my point. But I would never go as far as saying that globalization is over by any means. Jose, back to you.
Okay, we are on time. Okay, to conclude, I want to thank Victor, Elizabeth, Bo, Professor Joaquin, everybody for the excellent presentation on the state of the value chains in the world 2021 and the challenges faced in the world. In ECLAC, to conclude, we are very committed to supporting you in the development of the next value chain report, including a specific analysis on the state of regional value chains in Latin America. We have a lot of things to develop. We will try to surely coordinate with Joseph in the Asian Development Bank, Bo in JETRO, and Elizabeth also in EDP for do this. Have a good day, everyone in Latin America. Victor, you have to say something until to finish?
No, that's good. That's it.
Okay.
Once again, we are very glad that you were able to organize this for us, and we will look indeed forward to more collaboration. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank Victor. Okay, then have a good day, everyone in Latin America. Good evening in Europe and good night in Asia. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay,
bye.
thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.